Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. Today we are going to be discussing ways in which a journalist gets information for a news story. Now I want you to go ahead and pause the video and think of various ways that a journalist might get information for a story. The journalist might get information from other news sites. If there's a story that is continuing development, they might be able to pull from another news site. They might get their information from social media. Social media is a big one. Journalists love Facebook and Twitter and making sure that they can get their news out as quickly as possible to the public and getting information from the public. Another big way, they might decide to go to events. To my sports fans here, the way that a reporter is able to get the stat lines and see who wins the game and injury reports and injury updates is by going to games and watching events themselves in person. Well, there's one other way that we as journalists are able to get information, and it's a very important way, and that is through the interview. Now, like I said, we're going to be discussing interviewing in two parts, and today we're going to really be focusing on the pre-interview stages and making sure that we have all of the information that we need to get ready for the interview. So an interview is a conversation that a reporter has with another person, and this other person has information related to a story that a journalist is trying to write. Well, in getting ready to conduct an interview, the journalist has a little bit of work that she has to prepare herself so that she is ready to go and prepared when the time arises for her interview to start. So the very first thing that happens is that a journalist receives her assignment. She is told by her editor that this is the event that she is working and that she needs to make sure that she has at least one or two interviews to be ready for publication. Well, the first thing that a journalist is going to do is that he's going to find out the background. He's going to get to the source of the idea. And what this means is that this is kind of where beat reporting comes in, where beat journalism comes in. If you're going to cover a story, you need to be somewhat familiar with the story. For athletic stories, for athletic events such as games, the reporter needs to be familiar with both of the teams that are playing. Needs to be familiar with the idea of whether this game has playoff implications or any other kind of post-game implication. Needs to be familiar with the star players on the team. But let's expand beyond sports. If there's a person writing about the new iPhone release, well, that reporter needs to be familiar with the line of iPhones in the past and the kind of technology that Apple uses for the iPhones, key features of an iPhone, and so on and so forth. And this applies for other technology, this applies for other sports, this applies to anything and everything. The journalist needs to do a little bit of background research to get their mind in the right frame of mind. That way, again, they're a little bit more familiar with the material going in, and that way they can have a conversation about the story. The other thing that a good journalist needs to do is go ahead and prepare a list of names to look out for in an interview. If you're covering the latest NBA game, you want to go ahead and have an idea of some of the key players that you're going to interview and some of the key personnel like the head coach. If you're going to a press release because Samsung is releasing their next Galaxy phone, well, it would be good to know the CEO of Samsung. It would be good to know somebody on their public relations, their PR team, who works every day to make sure that Samsung is painted in a good light and is the public's face for Samsung. You also need to know the process. Now, when I say process, what I mean is you kind of need to know the schedule of events. If you're covering an athletic event, we always have the pre-game festivities, we have the game itself, and then we have the post-game. And oftentimes in the post-game, some of the star players will conduct a post-game interview. So you need to know what time that interview will take place and where to be in order to hear from some of these star players. For for things related to technology or space or business, if a company or an organization is saying that they are going to be at an event or hosting their own event, you need to go ahead and try to get some sort of schedule so that you know where to be and when to be. If that event is at the building that is at the headquarters for whatever organization you're interviewing, well, you need to know where that building is, and you need to know the different rooms and the different places that will be shown off or that people will be in during the event. And finally, you want to check with your editors. What specifically do your editors want? One example that I used in the traditional class was talking about the iPhone. Now, some of you might just now have your very first cell phone. Some of you might still not have a cell phone, and that's okay too. But there's some students who might have their second or third phone even. But many times people your age start off with phones that are a little bit older than the newest model out right now. Right? It's your first phone. It's okay that if it gets chipped or scratched or even lost, and if it needs to be. Well, a fairly common first phone that I heard in the traditional class today was the iPhone 4 or the iPhone SE, some of the more old school iPhones. And there are two key features of the iPhone 4 and the iPhone SE that are not in newer iPhones, that are in iPhone 10s and 11s. Does anybody know what those two features are? Well, those features are a home button and a headphone jack. And when both of those items were removed from the iPhone, they were removed at different times. The headphone jack went first, and then the home button went later. When both of those items were removed from the iPhone, it made news, and it stayed in the news. Every single article that a person read about the iPhone 7, which was the first iPhone to drop the headphone jack, every single article a person read made mention about the lack of a headphone jack, because that's what the editors wanted to make sure that the public knew. The editors wanted to make sure that the public knew, that the newspaper knew, that the iPhone 7 did not have a headphone jack and that it was a thing of the past. And the same thing with the home button. So it's always good to double check with your editors to make sure that you have what they want and that you know to interview and to get what they want. You also want to brainstorm the different angles that you might take a story. You definitely want to develop some questions going into the interview. Now, you might wind up not asking a single one of the questions that you had planned out. The conversation might really take off, and you might be able to have a completely off-the-cuff interview where, again, the conversation is good, questions are coming easy, and none of them are the questions that you intended to write down. And that's a good thing, and that is okay. But sometimes conversation drags a little bit. Sometimes, as you're interviewing somebody, the answer to a question that you asked might not have been the answer that you were looking for, or it might have been shorter than you were meaning to get. The answer might have been shorter than you were hoping to get. And so it's good to go ahead and have some questions kind of pre-made that help foster the discussion and help facilitate discussion. You also want to go ahead and determine your sources. Again, you want to know some people that you're going to interview, and you need to know what kind of relationship they have to a story. So if you're covering a basketball game and you know that you want to cover a particular player, you might have named that player, but you also need to make sure that that you know what position they are, and that you know what position they are and what plays they made. Finally, you want to make sure that you write down your interview time. You want to make sure that you have the time and place in particular, because there are a lot of people that you might interview throughout your time as a journalist that have very limited time slots. If you're supposed to interview the director of NASA and he says that he can grant you an interview at 12:45 for 10 minutes, If you try to show up for his interview at 1 o'clock, he won't be able to make the interview. And you know what that means? It means that you won't be able to get the information that you need for your story. So these are just a few of the pre-interview steps and pre-interview processes that you need to make sure that you have written down and that you know and are familiar with, so that when you do start the interview process, you are very prepared and very ready to get all of the information that you need to write a really good story.